Hello, travelers. It's been a long day for you already. You can now rest here. Listen to boring histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will dive into the topic Henry VIII and his 6 wives and many more. Let's begin. The candle burns low in the royal chamber. Wax drips like silent tears down its slender spine, casting long flickering shadows across stone walls etched with secrets. Outside, the wind weeps through the towers of Whitehall, and the Thames runs dark and heavy, carrying whispers from the palace to the sea. Time moves slowly here, thick as honey, cold as steel. The year is not important, only the silence matters. A silence thick with ghosts. In the quiet heart of England, a king cannot sleep. He stares into the fire, the weight of a crown pressing against his temples like a curse. Once it was gold and glory, now it is thorns. His kingdom is restless, torn between old faith and new, but his mind is elsewhere, drifting through memories of 6 faces, 6 names, 6 lifetimes. They come to him in the night like specters, whispering through velvet curtains, trailing fingers across his dreams. Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne, again, Catherine, again, and then the last Catherine. Each one loved, each one changed, each one devoured. This is not just the tale of a king and his queens. It is the unraveling of a man who believed he could bend fate to his will. It is a love story carved in blood and parchment, written by moonlight and sharpened with steel. It is the story of a throne built on broken vows, of women raised high and brought low, of power wrapped in silks and veils and shadow. And it begins long before the axe fell, long before the altar crumbled, long before the crown turned to ash. It begins with a wedding, a Spanish princess, a boy not yet king, and a promise made in the eyes of God too sacred to be broken, unless you are Henry. Before we continue on, leave a comment down below to let me know where you are from and what time you are listening to this. Also leave a like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy what I do here. She was born in a land of heat and gold, where the skies burned blue above palaces of red stone, and the scent of incense clung to the walls like memory. Spain, fierce, pious, resplendent. Her mother was Isabella, the warrior queen who had driven out the last of the Moors. Her father, Ferdinand, a king as calculating as he was devout. Into this union of fire and steel, Catherine was born, the youngest daughter, the one sent across the sea. They dressed her in silks and loaded the ships with dowry gold, crosses, and holy relics. She was 16 when she left Granada behind, the horizon behind her burning like the edge of a torn parchment, her hair braided with ribbons, her eyes wide but unreadable. She stood on the deck and watched her country vanish into mist. Ahead lay England, grey, wet, unknown. She had never seen her husband's face. The English court was colder in every sense. The firelight did not reach the corners of the chambers, and the language cut like frost. But Catherine bore it all with quiet dignity. She was here to fulfill a destiny, to become a queen. Her husband Arthur was pale and bookish, a prince not yet fully a man. They were joined in matrimony in a grand ceremony, the alliances of nations sealed with Latin vows, but there was no warmth between them. Barely months into their marriage, sickness swept through Ludlow Castle. Catherine fell ill, feverish and shivering, and when she rose again, it was as a widow. Everything should have ended there, but Catherine would not be sent home. She was too valuable, too royal, and too proud to return a failed bride. She lingered in England, a ghost in waiting. For 7 long years, she lived in limbo, caught in a strange, quiet war between courts, popes, and ambitions. Her dowry was contested, her future uncertain. Her Spanish maids thinned out, her clothes faded, her status was ambiguous, like a book half written. a candle left burning, but she waited. Through the cold halls of Richmond and Greenwich, through the long rains and thin bread, she endured. She wrote to her father, she prayed daily, she studied scripture, and she watched the young boy she had once met at court grow into a man, Henry, her late husband's younger brother, broad-shouldered, athletic, with laughter that echoed down the halls and charm that caught every noblewoman's eye. He was the sun rising again, and when he turned his gaze on her, she knew she had survived for something. Their marriage was a miracle and a question. The church hesitated. Had her union with Arthur been consummated? Catherine swore it had not. She swore it before God, before Henry, before heaven itself, and so the Pope agreed. Dispensation was granted, and at 17, Henry became king. At 23, Catherine became queen. England rejoiced. A Spanish rose on an English throne. The bells rang out for days, and for a time, perhaps the only true time, Henry was faithful. They hunted together, dined by candlelight, knelt in prayer. Catherine gave him dignity, culture, a sense of moral purpose. She taught him Spanish, read him Latin, embroidered his shirts. She was not merely a wife, she was a partner, and when rebellion flared in the north, she rode in armor and addressed the troops herself. "My heart is with you in the field," she told them. The men cheered. The queen was beloved, but fate has a way of souring sweetness. Her first child was a girl, stillborn, then a boy, Henry, who lived for weeks, then faded like a pale flame, another miscarriage, another stillbirth, and then finally a daughter, Mary, healthy, strong, but not a son, not an heir. Henry rejoiced politely, then resumed his waiting. Catherine aged, slowly, softly. The vibrance of youth gave way to the solemn grace of a queen, whose prayers were never answered. She fasted during Lent, knelt until her knees bled, whispered to saints in the dark. But each cradle remained empty, and behind the tapestry of royal life, cracks began to show. Henry, restless, still young, began to look elsewhere. First with casual lust, then with focused obsession. Anne Boleyn was unlike Catherine in every way. Younger, sharp, witty, and unafraid. She mocked tradition. She questioned everything. Henry was mesmerized. What began as flirtation spiraled into madness. He wrote her letters soaked in longing, promised her the world, and when she refused to be his mistress, he began to consider what had once been unthinkable. He would annul his marriage. At first, Catherine did not believe it. She had been queen for 20 years. She had prayed beside him, aged beside him, shared every sorrow and joy. She had ruled in his absence, comforted him in grief, celebrated him in triumph. But Henry's obsession with Anne grew like rot under the floorboards, slow, spreading, inevitable. The court grew tense. Whispers followed Catherine like shadows. Old friends turned their backs. Her confessor was replaced. Her chambers were moved. Henry declared their union invalid, insisting after decades that she had lied, that her first marriage had been real, and thus their own was illegitimate. Catherine's world collapsed, but she did not fall. She stood before a court of nobles and declared with fire in her voice and tears in her eyes, "When ye had me at first, I take God to be my judge. I was a true maid, without touch of man." She knelt before Henry, not as a queen, not as a subject, but as a woman who had loved him. "It was you who called me your wife. Before God, before the world, I am still your lawful wedded wife, and as such I will live and die." Henry turned his face. The Pope refused to grant the annulment. Henry broke from Rome. The Church of England was born, not from holy vision, but from the aching need for a male heir and a different woman's womb. Catherine was stripped of her title, forbidden from calling herself queen, moved to remote estates. Kimbolton Castle, cold and crumbling, separated from Mary, who was declared illegitimate. Alone, aging, and surrounded by spies, she refused to surrender. She still rose each morning and dressed as a queen. She signed letters as Catherine the Queen. She knelt for hours in the chapel and prayed not for revenge, but for Henry's soul. In the end, it was not the poison of court that killed her, but the quiet erosion of the heart. She died in January 1536, likely of cancer. Her hair had grayed, her hands trembled, but her spirit, her pride, never broke. Her last letter to Henry was not bitter. It was filled with grace. Mine eyes desire you above all things. I pardon you all. I pray God to bless you. He did not come to see her. He wore yellow on the day of her funeral. Some say it was mourning in Spain. Others say it was joy. But perhaps in the deepest part of his mind, there was a voice he could not silence. The voice of a girl who crossed a sea in faith. The voice of a queen who had loved with her whole soul. The voice of a woman who had never truly left him. She did not enter like a queen. She arrived like a warning, not with roses but with thorns, not with submission but with challenge. Anne Boleyn was not the sort of woman men expected to bow to, but somehow when she passed through a room, everyone found themselves watching. She was not the most beautiful, not in the soft, angelic way the court adored, but there was something in her, something in the tilt of her neck, the heat behind her eyes, the smile that stayed just one breath too long. She had been raised in the courts of Burgundy and France, where wit cut deeper than steel and power could be worn like perfume. She knew how to move, how to linger in doorways, how to let her silence speak louder than flattery. Her French was impeccable, her letters were sharp, her heart walled off behind 1,000 calculations. But when she returned to England, she was no one, just another lady-in-waiting in the glittering machinery of Queen Catherine's household. And then Henry looked at her. Perhaps it began with a glance, or maybe it was something more primal, something neither of them could name. She refused him, not in protest, but in design. Where others fell to their knees, Anne remained standing. Henry, who had never known denial, found himself drawn into orbit around her. She danced, and he followed. He offered her jewels. She returned them. He sent her letters, dozens of them, pages soaked in longing, declarations of torment and adoration. He was already a married man, already a king, but he was losing sleep, losing focus, losing control. Anne promised nothing, but let hope flicker in him like a flame behind glass. She told him, in careful words and clever glances, "If you want me, unmake the world," and he did. He shattered it. The court turned its head, unsure whether to sneer or kneel. The queen still sat beside him at mass. Catherine, serene and stately, refused to yield, but Henry was no longer hers. His letters to Anne grew frantic. "I am yours, body and soul." He begged the Pope for annulment. He was denied. He asked again. He was denied again. Anne waited, arms crossed. She would not be a mistress. She would be a wife, or she would be gone. The people called her a witch, a whore, a temptress. They threw fruit at her carriage, whispered that she had bewitched the king, that she had unnatural eyes, unnatural power. But Anne didn't flinch. She wore English pearls and a crucifix at her throat. She raised her chin higher. And in 1533, after nearly 7 years of waiting, Henry declared his marriage to Catherine void. The Archbishop of Canterbury crowned Anne Boleyn Queen of England. The bells rang again, but not as they had before. This time the joy was thinner. The city grumbled. Catherine's absence was a wound not yet healed. And Anne, though radiant in her coronation robes, had already begun to feel the crown as a weight. She was pregnant. Henry was triumphant. A new queen, a new wife, a new child. Surely now a son, but the child was a girl, born healthy, perfect, with eyes like fire and lungs full of rage. They named her Elizabeth. and while Henry smiled politely, Anne felt the cold steel of his disappointment enter her bloodstream. Still, she did not give up. She bled again, miscarried. Again, the whispers returned. The people had never loved her, and now even Henry was drifting. He began to flirt, to slip away from her bed, to speak with courtiers in tones that twisted her stomach, and yet she pushed on. She was not Catherine. She would not go quietly. Anna dug. Anna fought. She shouted in public, threw her fury like daggers. She scolded Henry, scorned his mistresses, accused his advisers. She was intelligent, too intelligent, and the court did not forgive that in a woman. They called her unstable, dangerous, poison-tongued. Henry, now king of his own church, no longer needed Rome to free him. He only needed a reason, and the court gave him one. Rumors turned into charges: adultery, treason, incest. They accused her of liaisons with courtiers, of dark magic, of laughing when the king was in pain. They named 5 men friends, musicians, even her own brother. Anne stood in the Tower of London and heard the charges read aloud. Her eyes did not waver. She laughed. None but the dead dare speak against me now. At her trial, she wore a black gown. Her speech was clear, composed, echoing through the chamber like the toll of a slow bell. She denied every accusation, spoke of her innocence, her loyalty, her love. But the verdict had already been written before she stepped into the hall. Guilty. Her execution was set for May 19, 1536. She asked not for a sword, but a French-style beheading, quicker, cleaner, less humiliating. On the morning of her death, she dressed carefully, as though for court, a grey damask gown, a crimson petticoat, and an ermine mantle. Her hair was pinned back beneath a simple hood. She walked to the scaffold with no tears in her eyes. There before the crowd she said only this: "I do not say I am innocent, but I die with the king's good will, and I pray God save his soul." She knelt, folding her hands. The French executioner, imported specially for her, raised the sword. She never saw it fall. Her body was placed in an arrow chest, the only coffin they had on hand. She was 35. The daughter she left behind, the girl born of disappointment and silence, would one day rule the kingdom as one of its greatest monarchs. But Anna Boleyn, in the end, was dust erased from portraits, her name scraped from records, her story rewritten, and yet, in the cold stone of the tower, where her feet once passed, the wind still carries her defiance. The woman who broke a kingdom in half to become queen, and was broken in turn for daring to be more than a man's desire. She came like a breath after a storm. No thunder, no lightning, only quiet. Jane Seymour was the stillness that followed Anne's tempest, the cool morning mist that settled over a kingdom raw from too many wounds. Where Anne had burned with fire, Jane offered water. Where Anne had challenged, Jane yielded. Where Anne had captivated, Jane consoled. She had been there all along, in the background, in the margins, a pale figure at court, unremarkable to the eye, soft-spoken, modest, devout. She did not demand the king's attention. He found it in her, a lady-in-waiting to both queens before her. She had learned from their fates, watched the rise and fall of Catherine, the rise and execution of Anne, and knew somewhere deep inside that silence too could be a weapon. Henry saw her and felt relief. She did not tempt him with defiance. She did not stir rebellion in his blood. Jane was everything Anne had never been: obedient, humble, seemingly without ambition. She did not write him letters full of wit. She embroidered, she prayed, she blushed, she looked at him with eyes that did not challenge, but reflected a mirror in which he could again feel strong, righteous, beloved. He was nearly 45 now, thicker at the waist, heavy with guilt and failure. But Jane made him feel new again. Less than 24 hours after Anna's execution, Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour. 11 days later, they were married. The court barely had time to breathe. Jane, now Queen of England, moved cautiously through the wreckage. She knew the ghosts she followed. She knew the murmurs in the corridors. She knew she was loved for what she was not, more than for what she was, and so she leaned into that role. She spoke little in public. She refused a lavish coronation. She sewed shirts for the poor, walked behind her husband with downcast eyes, and never ever spoke of Anne, but in private she made one request: restore Princess Mary. Catherine's daughter, banished and declared illegitimate, had been stripped of her titles and accent. Jane, perhaps moved by pity, perhaps by diplomacy, urged Henry to forgive her. She pressed gently, never forcefully, never in a way that would make him feel weak. And slowly, Mary was brought back into favor, not as heir, but as daughter. Jane had done what Catherine could not, what Anne had refused to do. She brought peace, however small, to a father and a child. And then, after 15 months of quiet reign, Jane gave Henry the one thing no woman had before: a son. It was October, 1537. She labored for 2 full days and nights, her pale hands clenched around the bedsheets, her prayers whispered in Latin between screams, and at last, when the pain seemed too great for any human body to bear, the child came into the world. Edward, the longed-for heir, the golden promise of a future finally secured. The court exploded with joy. Bells rang in every church. Bonfires lit the sky. Henry wept, truly wept, for the first time in years. He called Jane his true wife, his beloved queen, the mother of his legacy. But Jane was dying. The fever set in quickly. Infection. Exhaustion. Her skin turned to wax, her breath shallow, her voice fading into a whisper. Henry stayed by her side, pacing, praying, helpless. And on October 24th, just 12 days after giving him his only legitimate son, Jane Seymour slipped away. She was 28, the quiet queen gone as gently as she had come. Henry wore mourning longer for Jane than for any of his wives. He kept her portrait near his bed. He never remarried while she was still fresh in his grief, and when he died, years later, bloated and broken, it was beside her that he chose to be buried. Not Catherine, not Anne, Jane. The only one who gave him what he wanted, and the only one who never lived long enough to fall from grace. She arrived to him like a painting, not flesh, not voice, not scent. Only pigment and promise, colors on canvas sent across cold waters. Her face, brushed by the careful hands of Hans Holbein, seemed serene, modest, gentle-eyed, a portrait fit for peace. After the fury and death of the past, that was all Henry craved: a treaty in a woman's skin, a breath between battles. It was 1539, and Europe had grown dangerous. Spain and France, once at odds, were now eyeing one another with the gaze of uneasy allies. The Pope stirred against him still, whispering curses over the breach with Rome. Henry, alone on his island, sought protection not from a sword, but from a marriage. And so he turned his gaze eastward, to the Protestant Duchy of Cleves. It was there that Anakin waited, unknowingly cast in a role she never auditioned for. She had never been groomed for a crown. Anne of Cleves was not a courtly woman. She could not sing or dance. She had not been trained in the art of flirtation, had never been asked to charm or entertain. She had been taught instead to sew, to obey, to move quietly in her brother's house. Her life had been plain, practical. She wore German fashions, high-necked, boxy, built like armor against seduction. Her mind was sincere, if not sharp, her soul unprepared for the theatre of Henry's England. And yet, as politics tightened their grip, Henry signed the betrothal unseen. Holbein had painted her with care, a slight smile, soft cheeks, the gaze of one who might soothe a storm. Henry, nearing 50, clung to hope. His past wives were ghosts in his halls. Catherine, exiled and dead. Anna Boleyn, executed. Jane Seymour, gone in childbirth. His son a fragile infant, his heart hollowed. He needed this union to work. He rode out in secret to meet her, filled with anticipation, and then he saw her, not the woman in the portrait, not the gentle angel on paper, but a stranger, broad-faced, stoic, no flicker of seduction in her glance, no poetry in her manner. Anna Cleves, tired from travel, dressed in thick northern wool, eyes downcast and unsure, she curtsied as instructed, smiled with restraint. Henry recoiled inside. Later, he would tell his advisers, "She is nothing so fair as she hath been reported," to his friend Thomas Cromwell. "I like her not," but the treaty had already been signed, the wedding scheduled, and so on January 6, 1540, Anne of Cleves was crowned Queen of England. Henry barely touched her. She was as confused as he was disgusted. She had done nothing wrong, yet felt herself wrong in every way. She did not understand the games of courtship. She did not meet his eyes. When he approached her, she stiffened. When he kissed her, she turned. He called her Flanders mare behind closed doors. He blamed everyone else, Cromwell, the painters, fate itself. But the truth was this: Henry was too vain to endure disappointment, and Anne was too unfamiliar to inspire desire. The marriage was never consummated. For 6 months she wore the crown like borrowed clothing, ill-fitting and itchy at the seams. She tried. She smiled when asked. She bore the silence of the king. She attended banquets, nodded in councils, learned the rules too late. But by summer, Henry had already begun to look elsewhere, toward a young girl in the shadows of his court, Catherine Howard. 19, radiant, everything Anne was not. The path was already being swept clean for her. Anne was summoned in July. She was told, gently, that the marriage had been a mistake, that it had never truly been a marriage at all. Henry, ever concerned with legality when it suited him, declared it invalid. No consummation, no binding, no sin. He offered her a generous settlement, estates, money, the title of king's sister. Anne could have fought, others had. But Anne of Cleves, perhaps wiser than she appeared, accepted. She bowed her head, signed the annulment, and stepped quietly out of the queen's chamber. She left the palace not in disgrace, but in strange, unexpected peace. And so Anne lived, while Catherine Howard would die for her youth, while others would fall to ambition, betrayal, or childbirth. Anne of Cleves outlived them all. She remained in England untouched by scandal, traveling between country estates, attending court occasionally with calm, unremarkable grace. She visited Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth. She sent gifts on Edward's birthday. She embroidered, hosted small gatherings, read German books by the hearth. She lived through the death of Henry. She lived through the reign of his son, through the fires of Mary's rule, into the rise of Elizabeth, and when she died in 1557, at the age of 41, she was the last of Henry's wives, still breathing, the one he barely kissed, the one who outlasted the storm. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in a quiet corner far from the grand tombs of kings. No towering monument, no gilded legacy, just a slab of stone, worn thin by time. But Anne of Cleves, for all her awkwardness and all her miscasting, had achieved what none of the others could. She survived Henry VIII, and in the end, That may be the most remarkable love story of all. Not of passion, but of escape. She was a song he could not hold. Catherine Howard danced into Henry's life like spring breaking through a dying winter, light, lilting, irreverent. She did not walk through court. She shimmered. Laughter followed her like perfume. Silk whispered at her heels. Her eyes were bright with the recklessness of 17 and the cruel innocence of someone too young to see the blade hidden in the crown. He was nearly 50. She was barely grown, but Henry bloated, breathless, his leg forever ulcered, his heart a graveyard, looked upon her and remembered life, real life. The kind that pulsed and glimmered, not the kind weighed down by airs and treaties and ghosts of wives past. Catherine Howard was not a treaty. She was not a duty. She was not chosen for diplomacy, or bloodlines, or religious balance. She was chosen because she made him feel alive. She called him my sweet. She brought music to his chambers again, lutes and harps and dancing feet. She dressed in pinks and pearls, her laughter sharp and sudden, her touch feather-light. He watched her the way a dying man might watch a flame, afraid to breathe too close lest it vanish, and for a time Henry was happy. He lavished her with jewels, gowns, palaces. He paraded her like a trophy he'd stolen back from death. He called her his rose without a thorn, and in that lie he let himself believe. He forgot the ticking clock in his chest, forgot his Anakin leg, forgot Jane's pale ghost. He touched Catherine as if touch could hold time still. She was crowned Queen of England in August of 1540. But Catherine Howard had secrets. She had not arrived at court untouched. Behind her sweet smiles and flushed cheeks lay a trail of whispered names. Francis Derham, Henry Manox, young men from her girlhood, from her days in the Duchess of Norfolk's household, where supervision was light and passions were heavy. These were not the sins of a queen, they were the sins of a girl. But in Henry's court, the two were not allowed to exist in the same skin. Worse still, while married, while adored, Catherine began to look elsewhere. Youth, after all, seeks youth. She, vibrant and caged, found herself drawn to Thomas Culpeper, a favored courtier, handsome, bold, close enough to touch when the king turned his head. Letters passed between them, some frantic, some tender. Late-night meetings arranged in secret, behind closed doors, watched only by the shadows. It was foolish, it was inevitable, and it would be fatal. Rumors began to hum beneath the tapestries. At first, small things, a name mentioned twice. A page's footsteps in the wrong corridor. Then louder, letters discovered, a servant interrogated. Francis Derham, once cast aside, had returned to court, expecting favor, but instead of favor, he brought ruin. The Privy Council came for her in November. Catherine collapsed when the accusations were read aloud. She screamed, denied, wept, confessed, recanted. The truth came out in slivers, contradictions, and trembling hands. Henry was told, and the illusion cracked. The rose had thorns after all. His face, once flush with love, turned to stone. He did not see her again. She was imprisoned in Sion Abbey, stripped of her title, her jewels, her dignity. The court turned cold. Courtiers who once praised her beauty now whispered of her shame. Even her family, the mighty Howards, stepped back, fearful of their own ruin. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were executed first. Culpeper beheaded, quiet and composed. Derham, not so fortunate, drawn and quartered in a display meant to freeze the court's blood. And then on the night of February 12, 1542, Catherine Howard, just 19 years old, was led through the frozen halls of the Tower of London. Her hair was cropped, her dress plain. She asked for the execution block to be brought to her cell the night before, so she could practice laying her neck upon it. They say she whispered, I'd die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Kultir." The morning was bitter. She walked to the scaffold with composure. She looked out at the pale, silent crowd, strangers, some of whom had once praised her beauty, all of whom would outlive her, and knelt. She died with the grace no one had expected of her, and in that moment the echoes of Anakin's on in Milan returned. Another young queen, condemned, betrayed by love, by politics, by history's cruel hand. Henry did not watch. He mourned quietly, though no one knows what he mourned more, Catherine's betrayal or the shattering of yet another illusion. With her death, something inside him curdled. He would never love again, not truly. His body swelled further. His mind grew darker. The court grew quieter. Even the music seemed afraid to play too brightly. Catherine Howard was not a queen built for survival. She was a spark, brief, brilliant, beautiful, and doomed from the start. But for a moment she brought color to a kingdom graying under the weight of age. For a moment she reminded the king of joy, of risk, of youth. And like all flames caught in a cold wind, she did not last. By the time she came to him, Henry was already dying. Not in the way that men fall suddenly, but in the long, slow crumbling of body and memory. A king wrapped in furs and festering flesh, surrounded by silence and suspicion. His face had bloated. His leg oozed rot beneath velvet stockings. His eyes, once sharp, once golden, had turned heavy with blood and regret. He had buried 4 wives, cast off 2, watched his empire twist in fire and reform. The page was curling. The ink had dried crooked, and then came Catherine. Not a girl, not a beauty, but something rarer, wisdom. She was 31 when they met, nearly twice the age of his last queen, twice widowed, twice weathered by grief. She had learned how to walk through this world with caution and courage folded beneath her bodice like a second spine. Her hands had nursed the dying. Her mind had devoured books. She spoke Latin, wrote prose, debated scripture with the boldness of a cleric. Catherine Parr did not arrive like springtime or seduction. She arrived like reason. The court watched her with wary eyes. Henry had become unpredictable, a man who gave and destroyed with equal breath. But Catherine knew how to read a storm. She smiled with discretion, listened before speaking. When Henry proposed, she hesitated, not from coyness, but from fear. Her heart belonged, quietly, to another, Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane, whose charm had stirred her widow's grief into something new. But personal desire had no place at the feet of kings. She married Henry in July of 1543. His 6th queen, his last, and with that union she became not just a wife, but a caretaker. Catherine nursed him, dressed his sores, read to him when the pain grew too loud. She bathed him in lavender and held his hand while physicians whispered behind tapestries. She organized his medicine. She soothed his rages. She prayed beside his bed. Hers was not a marriage of flesh, but of vigilance. A woman married to a crumbling nation in a dying man's skin. Yet beneath the veil of duty, Catherine stirred the realm in quiet ways. She reunited Henry with his daughters, Mary, now a wary adult, Elizabeth, watchful and brilliant. Under Catherine's careful hand, the two were brought back into favor, allowed again to learn, to be seen, to be called princesses. She fostered education, gathered scholars, translated devotional texts into English. She wrote books under her own name, prayers or meditations, and later lamentations of a sinner, the first queen of England to publish her thoughts with her name in ink. But progress walks a narrow ledge. Catherine leaned Protestant in a court, still haunted by the ghosts of Catholicism. She debated theology, challenged bishops, read banned books by candlelight, and it nearly cost her everything. In 1546, when Henry's health had decayed into fury and fever, conservative courtiers whispered poison into his ears. They accused Catherine of heresy, of daring to question scripture, of threatening the order of things. A warrant for her arrest was drawn, signed, prepared in silence. But Catherine found it, or rather someone loyal placed it in her hands, and that night she wept, then rose and went to Henry. She did not protest, she did not debate, she apologized. She claimed her discussions of faith were only a humble woman's attempt to distract the king from his pain. She declared herself ignorant, needing correction, leaning only on his great wisdom. Henry forgave her. The warrant vanished. The tower gates remained closed. Catherine, once again, had read the storm and stepped away before the lightning struck. In January of 1547, the king began to die in truth. Bloated, incoherent, unable to move without pain, Henry lay surrounded by silence. He made no grand speeches. He did not confess. He forbade anyone to speak of death. But Catherine stayed, reading psalms as his breath thickened, as the room grew colder, as the servants wept in doorways. He died in the night. 6 wives, 3 children, thousands dead by his word, 1 reformation, and now silence. Catherine Parr was a widow once more, but this time she was not alone. She had the favor of the realm, the respect of 2 princesses, the love of the people who had watched her serve, not shine. And for a moment Catherine lived freely. She married her old love, Thomas Seymour, just months after Henry's death. It was a scandal too soon, too selfish, some whispered, but she did not care. She had served a king and survived. Now she would serve herself. She moved to Sudeley Castle, where she read, wrote, and laughed again. And at 35, she became pregnant for the first time. The baby was a girl, Mary Seymour. But joy in Tudor England was always brief. Catherine died from childbirth fever just days after delivery. The nursemaid said she raved at the end, suspecting her husband's betrayal, accusing him of unkindness. Whether the fever spoke or truth did, no one knows. She was buried in the chapel at Sudeley, wrapped in velvet, surrounded by roses. And so Catherine Parr, queen, scholar, nurse, survivor, was the final chapter in a story etched in blood and silence. She did not rise like Anna Boleyn, nor fall like Catherine Howard. She endured. She read the king's mind when others tried to change it. She healed wounds she did not cause. She lifted children out of exile. She translated the sacred into the spoken. She guided the dying with candlelight and reason. And in the end, she left behind not only a daughter, but a legacy of words. A voice unburned, a mind unbroken, a woman unbowed. History remembers him as the man with 6 wives, but it forgets that they were not just wives. They were women, and the weight of his crown was never borne alone. There was Catherine of Aragon, the warrior's daughter, who crossed oceans with hope in her eyes, and died with honor in her silence. She stood her ground even as it crumbled beneath her, loved by the people. Abandoned by the man, her strength was not loud, but enduring, like stone beneath a cathedral. There was Anne Boleyn, fire and silk, who danced with destiny and died by it. She rose like lightning, flashing against the dark sky, brilliant and blinding. Her fall was not just from grace, but from the world itself, beheaded for the sin of ambition, for the crime of changing a king. But her daughter would become the most powerful queen England had ever known. There was Jane Seymour, quiet as snowfall, the soft breath between storms. She gave Henry what no other could, a son, and paid for it with her life, the only one he buried as a queen, perhaps the only one he mourned in truth. Her memory became a shrine he returned to in his final days, aching not for love, but for the peace she had worn so gently. There was Anne of Cleves, the survivor, misjudged by portraits, married in haste, set aside with surprising kindness. She played her cards with grace and lived in comfort, respected as the king's sister. She outlived them all. No scandal, no execution, no legend of romance or betrayal, just quiet survival, like a flame that refuses to go out. There was Catherine Howard, the girl queen, too young to see the trap she'd stepped into, a spark in a dying man's heart, brief and burning. Her laughter once echoed through the palace halls. Later, only silence followed her name. She was not built for the cruelty of courts. And yet in her tragedy, she became unforgettable. And there was Catherine Parr, the final wife, the watchful one, not chosen for beauty, but for wisdom. She healed, she taught, she wrote. She held the kingdom's fraying edges together with steady hands while the king decayed. She read scripture beside his bed and stitched up his legacy when no one else dared to touch it. She lived, she endured, she escaped with her soul. 6 women, 6 lives, each one changed by the orbit of a king too large, too proud, too human. Some were destroyed, some survived, all were remembered, though not always fairly, and Henry powerful, monstrous, charming, sick, brilliant, left behind a throne soaked in blood and draped in velvet, a crown that had weighed too heavily on too many heads. But it is through the eyes of these women that we see the truth of the Tudor court, not in battles or proclamations, but in love letters, locked doors, shattered dreams, and final words whispered on the scaffold. The wives of Henry VIII were not merely chapters in his story, they were stories of their own, and together they formed the echo that outlived the king. The fall of the Romanovs, the last days of Imperial Russia. In the soft golden glow of winter's last breath, the palace was still. The wind howled beyond the windows, shaking the ice-laden branches against the glass like a warning. But within, the world remained as grand as it had ever been. Velvet tapestries hung heavy on the walls, crystal chandeliers caught the last vestiges of light, and the faint scent of fresh flowers still filled the rooms. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, a man once revered as the protector of millions, now found himself a prisoner of his own making, a king who had seen his empire fracture beneath the weight of his inherited crown. Outside, the snowstorms of revolution were gathering. The Bolsheviks had spread their flames of revolt like wildfire, and the winds of change were weeping through the land. His world, which had once seemed immovable, now trembled under the pressure of 1,000 shattered promises and 1,000 voices that cried out for equality. But inside the walls of the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, Nicholas and his family clung to the illusion of normality. The halls echoed with the voices of children, the sound of laughter that once belonged to an empire that had ruled with a divine hand. The Romanovs, the world's richest and most powerful family, had once moved like gods in a court of their own making. They were the embodiment of Imperial Russia, a dazzling, often untouchable family, draped in gold and silk, their names whispered with reverence across Europe. But now they were not gods, they were prisoners. The downfall of Tsar Nicholas II did not happen overnight. It was a slow and subtle unraveling, built over years of mismanagement, political miscalculations, and the gathering shadows of a revolution that no one seemed to see coming. Least of all, Nicholas himself. He was a man of peace, surrounded by advisors who had failed him, and consumed by the relentless pull of duty. But more than the pressures of war or famine, the most significant blow to his reign came from within his own palace. Grigory Rasputin, Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin was an enigma, a man born in Siberia to peasants who rose to prominence through mysterious means, claiming to have healing powers. He found his way into the imperial household, first as a confidant to the Tsarina, Alexandra, whose young son, Tsarevich Alexei, suffered from hemophilia. Rasputin's strange influence over Alexandra grew as he became a spiritual advisor to the royal family, and eventually to the point of near control over them. He was a man who made many uncomfortable, a mystic with a mesmerizing presence, whose eyes burned with intensity, whose aura seemed to bend the world around him. He had an uncanny ability to soothe Alexei's suffering with his prayers, his touch, but at a cost. His hold over Alexandra deepened, and by extension, his sway over the Russian court. But Rasputin was more than just a healer. He became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the empire, an outsider with the power to manipulate, an eccentric with more control over the monarchy than the generals and ministers who had once shaped Russia's fate. The rumors of his debauchery, his dark influence, and his disregard for the sanctity of the royal family's reputation spread like wildfire. Many in Russia began to see Rasputin as the embodiment of corruption, of decay at the heart of the monarchy. As the war escalated, so did the discontent of the people. The suffering of soldiers on the front lines, the starvation of civilians, and the massive strain on the Russian economy all pointed to one undeniable truth. The Romanovs were out of touch with the reality of the Russian people. Nicholas II's faith in Rasputin's guidance was seen as the final sign of a monarchy in denial. By 1917, the empire had begun to crumble under the pressure of war, food shortages, and the insistent calls for change. The February Revolution broke out like a thunderclap, and Nicholas found himself faced with the unthinkable, an abdication he had never seen coming. The Romanovs, once considered untouchable, were suddenly helpless in the face of an angry, war-weary population. Nicholas was forced to step down, not just as Tsar, but from his very identity. His reign, his family's entire existence, was over. The imperial family was taken into custody, their wealth stripped away, their titles revoked. The palace, once a refuge of riches and splendor, became a gilded cage. They were moved first to Tsarskoye Selo, then to Tobolsk in Siberia. For a brief moment, the Romanovs lived as they had in the past, quietly, as though nothing had changed, but the air was thick with the knowledge that their time was running out. By the summer of 1918, the Romanovs had been moved to the remote city of Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. The family, now completely isolated, was confined to a small house, stripped of luxuries and any hope of escape. The Bolshevik Revolution had swept across Russia like wildfire, and Lenin had declared that no royal family would be allowed to survive. In the heart of this desolate, winter-wrapped town, the Romanovs were marked for death. On the evening of July 16, 1918, as the moon rose over the snow-covered fields, the final chapter of the Romanov story was written in blood. They were summoned, under the pretext of a meeting, Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, along with their loyal servants, were gathered in the basement of the Ipatiev house, a former merchant's residence that had been turned into their prison. The family, unaware of their fate, gathered in a dimly lit room, waiting for what they thought would be another round of uncertainty. The door opened, and a group of Bolshevik soldiers filed in, their rifles pointed at the royal family. The air was heavy with anticipation, with the sound of pounding hearts and the cold breath of finality. The orders were clear. This was the end of the Romanovs. The family, to their credit, remained calm. Nicholas, ever the Tsar, took his final stand, instructing his children to kneel and pray. In that moment, they were no longer the imperial family. They were just a family, a father, a mother, and their children, forced to face their mortality with dignity. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything was silenced. The gunshots rang out, echoing through the basement, their sounds reverberating into history. The Romanovs were dead, but the story did not end there. The bodies were hastily disposed of, hidden in a mine shaft, as the Bolsheviks sought to cover their tracks. But history does not forgive. The remains of the Romanovs were eventually found, and their deaths were immortalized as a symbol of the end of an empire, the fall of a dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries. The death of Tsar Nicholas II and his family marked the official end of the Romanov dynasty. A new age was dawning in Russia, one of revolution, terror, and the rise of the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks had won, and the last vestiges of the Russian monarchy had been extinguished forever. But even in death, the Romanovs would not be forgotten. Their tragic end became a symbol, a moment frozen in time, where an empire fell and the world turned a page. Their story would echo through history, a story of opulence, betrayal, and ultimately the fragility of power. The House of Romanov had been one of the world's mightiest, and yet it was brought to its knees by the revolution it had underestimated, by the people it had ignored, and by the forces it could never control. As the Soviet Union rose, the Romanov family would remain a whispered memory of a time long past, when Russia was ruled by emperors and empresses, and when the world was still bound by old rules, old blood, and old crowns. The days in Ekaterinburg had grown colder. The Russian winter arrived like an inevitable death, crawling across the snow-covered earth and thickening the silence around the royal family. The Apateyev house, their prison, stood isolated amidst the barren landscape, its windows boarded up and its doors locked with an unnerving finality. It was no longer a residence but a cage, a place where memories of a past life clung to the walls like ghosts, reminders of the empire that had once held them all in its mighty grasp. Nicholas II had always been a man of duty. His commitment to his country and his family was absolute, but in the cold, lonely expanse of the house, stripped of his power, his hit, and his freedom, Nicholas was confronted with something much deeper, the fragile threads of his humanity. No longer was he a czar in a grand palace, leading a vast empire. Now he was simply a man lost in a foreign land, besieged by the cruel forces of history, and imprisoned within the narrow walls of his own royal destiny. His marriage to Alexandra, his devotion to her, had always been the cornerstone of his existence, but now it felt as though that bond too was fraying, worn down by the weight of the present. Tsarina Alexandra had always been a woman of intense emotions, and her love for her husband, as well as her children, had been unwavering. But the days of grandeur, the lavish court life, the adoration of millions, had evaporated in the face of revolution and exile. Now she lived with an almost unshakable fear, a fear that gnawed at her bones. She could feel the tension in the air, the whispers of what awaited them. Despite everything, she held on to one thing: her children. Her greatest fear was for their safety. She had watched the world crumble around them, and had seen her children's innocence destroyed in an instant. Tsarevich, Alexei, with his hemophilia, had always been the center of her existence, and the world had not been kind to him. His sickness had marked him as fragile in a world that was growing colder and more merciless by the day. In her heart, Alexandra knew that the survival of her family depended on something more than just power. It depended on the simple human need to love and protect those closest to her. Yet, in the bitter winter of 1918, that was no longer enough. The Romanovs had lived in confinement for months before the final act in Ekaterinburg. During that time, they had found ways to hold on to fragments of normalcy, living as though the weight of their former lives might someday return. The palace, once filled with the hum of bustling courtiers and grand balls, had now become eerily quiet, with only the soft clatter of teacups or the gentle rustling of pages as their company. The royal children, despite the tragedy that had befallen them, remained remarkably resilient. Olga, the oldest of the daughters, was the calm and steadying presence. She took on the role of caring for her siblings, her demeanor always composed, but her heart, like her mother's, was heavy with dread. Tatiana, close in age to Olga, had a nurturing side. and her warmth offered the family moments of comfort during long, dreary days. Maria, always a playful and spirited child, clung to the innocence that her youth afforded her. She would often smile through her fear, hiding it behind a mask of brightness. Anastasia, the youngest, was the most vivacious, a girl with an irrepressible energy, quick to laugh, quick to charm. She had the audacity of youth, but also a sensitivity that made her the heart of the family. And then there was Alexei, the frail Tsarevich, whose pain was a constant weight on their hearts. His small, delicate body bore the burden of illness with courage, his dark eyes reflecting the hope that somehow, in some way, they would survive the chaos around them. Though they were prisoners in the truest sense of the word, the Romanovs tried to maintain their familial bond, relying on each other for strength. They would gather for meals, pray together, and seek comfort in the routines that had once defined their lives. But the invisible specter of their fate loomed over them, a presence that could never be escaped. The walls of the house closed in on them with each passing day, and outside, the snow continued to fall relentlessly, mirroring the growing coldness of their existence. The Bolshevik soldiers who guarded them, though largely indifferent, became more nervous with each passing day. There was tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that the Romanovs' time was running out, that the moment of their reckoning was near. They could feel it in the way the orders from Moscow grew more insistent, more ominous. There was no longer any debate about the family's fate. The revolution was in full swing, and the Romanovs had become a symbol of everything the Bolsheviks sought to destroy. The family's fate had been sealed long before they set foot in Ekaterinburg. The seeds of their downfall had been planted years earlier in the strange and elusive figure of Grigory Rasputin. Though he was no longer physically present by the time the family was imprisoned, his influence hung over them like a dark cloud. Rasputin, with his mystical powers, had become both a savior and a curse to the Romanovs. His ability to heal Alexei's hemophilia had earned him the undying loyalty of Alexandra, who saw him as a man of God, a divine instrument sent to protect her son. But Rasputin's increasing control over the royal family had drawn the suspicion of Russia's aristocracy. The rumors of his sexual debauchery, his political manipulation, and his stranglehold over the Tsarina were rampant. Even as the monarchy crumbled, Rasputin's name remained tied to the Romanovs, a reminder of their vulnerability to influence and superstition. In a world that was rapidly changing, he was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the old order, an outsider who had infiltrated the heart of the royal family and brought with him an aura of corruption that no amount of gold could cleanse. When Rasputin was finally murdered in December 1916, it was seen as a triumph by many of the aristocracy, but it came too late. The Romanovs could not escape the consequences of their association with the mystic. The family's troubles were not simply due to Rasputin's influence. They were a product of a crumbling empire, a world too far removed from its people, and a monarchy blind to the forces of revolution brewing beneath its feet. The evening of July 16, 1918, arrived like a slow drumbeat, steady, relentless, and foreboding. The Romanovs, gathered in the basement of the Apateyev house, were told that they would be photographed. It was a cruel prelude, a final act of dignity for a family that had once been revered across the world. The family entered the room one by one, the children trailing behind their parents. Nicholas, always the protector, held his wife's hand tightly, as though to shield her from what they both knew was coming. Alexandra, ever faithful to her husband, stood beside him, her strength masking the terror that had taken root in her heart. For a brief moment, there was silence. The soldiers filed in, their rifles gleaming under the dim light, their faces hard and unreadable. No words were exchanged. There was nothing left to say. The shots rang out. The first to fall was Nicholas, the Tsar who had never wanted to be a Tsar, the man who had borne the weight of an empire on his shoulders. His death was quick. Alexandra followed, collapsing beside him, her hands still clutching his, even in the final moments. The children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, fell next, each one's life snuffed out by the cold steel of revolution. Pozarevich Alexei, ever frail, succumbed last, his body bleeding out beside his sister's. The gunfire was followed by the sound of their bodies hitting the floor. The Romanovs were no more. The death of the Romanovs marked the end of Russia's imperial age. A new era began, one that would see the rise of the Soviet Union, a regime that would endure for decades, casting a long shadow over the country's history. The remains of the Romanovs were disposed of hastily, buried in a mass grave, their bodies hidden away in a secret location for decades. Yet, even in death, the family's story would not be forgotten. Their tragic end became a symbol of a world gone wrong, of an empire that had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Years later, their remains would be exhumed and identified, and their deaths would come to represent the final chapter of the Russian monarchy, a moment in history when the past was laid to rest and a new order was born from the ashes of an old world. In the silence of the Ipatiev house, amidst the snow and the wind, the last echoes of the Romanovs would forever linger, a reminder that even the most powerful families can fall, and that the crown is a burden that few can bear. A day in Pompeii. Before the sky fell, the morning sun bathed the streets of Pompeii in a warm, golden light. It was a typical day for the bustling Roman town, a day like any other, brimming with life, commerce, and the hum of a community in motion. Yet there was something in the air, something beneath the surface of normalcy that would soon be undone by the wrath of nature. But at this moment, as the city came to life, the quiet presence of Mount Vesuvius stood looming on the horizon, its threat unfelt, its quiet pulse almost unnoticed in the everyday rhythm of Pompeian life. The town, nestled along the Bay of Naples, was a marvel of Roman engineering and urban planning. Its streets, paved with stones, wound in a careful grid system, guiding the flow of people, animals, and carts. The Forum, an open-air marketplace, was already filling with activity as vendors set up their stalls. The sounds of merchants calling out prices, the clink of coin against stone, and the lively chatter of citizens filled the air. This was Pompeii at the peak of its existence, an economically prosperous town with a thriving population and a social order that functioned like a well-oiled machine. The market was the heart of Pompeii's social life. It was here that the locals mingled, conducted business, and exchanged gossip. The heavy scent of fresh bread from the bakeries mixed with the tang of fish being hawked by fishermen, their catch still shimmering with life. Fruits, oranges, figs, and grapes were piled high in baskets, their colors vivid against the dusty backdrop of the marketplace. Olive oil, a staple in Roman cuisine, flowed from amphorae, while butchers with their aprons stained red stood by tables of neatly arranged cuts of meat. Lucius, a middle-aged vendor, peddled his wares from a stall beneath the shade of a stone awning. His fingers were deft as he arranged sprigs of rosemary and thyme, preparing for the lunch rush. He greeted his regular customers with familiarity, exchanging pleasantries in between taking their orders for finely sliced meats or the occasional jar of fermented fish sauce, a delicacy beloved by Pompeians. "Good morning, Quintus. Another jar of garum today, and your usual loaf of bread, I assume?" Lucius called out to a man who approached his stall. Quintus, a merchant known for his traveling goods, smiled back, his face darkened with age, but still carrying the sharpness of someone accustomed to bartering. "Yes, and add some olives as well, Lucius. The wife insists on a new batch. You know how she is." The town was alive with the details of daily life, each person unaware of the disaster that was about to overtake them. For all the sensory overload, the chatter of voices, the hiss of oil lamps, the clinking of coins. The true nature of the day would soon change in an instant. Elsewhere in the city, other parts of Pompeii's vibrant life unfolded in quieter corners. The public bathhouses, where both men and women could unwind and socialize, were filling with people. The baths were a cornerstone of Roman social life, a place not only to cleanse the body, but to cleanse the mind of the stresses of daily life. Here, citizens would relax in the steamy atmosphere, gossip, and discuss matters of politics, business, and love. Gaius, a retired soldier now living comfortably in Pompeii, was lounging in the caldarium, the hot bath, his weathered skin softening under the intense warmth of the water. Around him, other men spoke of the latest gladiator games, the quality of wine in the taverns, and the rumors of political unrest sweeping through the empire. The rhythmic splashing of water against marble echoed in the vast, domed room, and the scent of oils and perfumes lingered in the air, mixing with the sound of quiet conversation. One man leaned in closer, whispering conspiratorially, "You hear about the latest word from Rome. They say Nero's reforms are failing. They may not last long." Gaius chuckled, his voice rich with the perspective of someone who had seen the empire stretch and shrink in equal measure. "Nero's reforms? A fool's errand. The empire's power is in its army, not its senate. As long as that holds, the rest will sort itself out." But as they spoke of Rome's struggles, little did they know that Pompeii was about to be swept into a very different kind of destruction, one that would not be seen from politics or the sword, but from a force far beyond the control of any emperor or general. In the courtyards between the bustling shops and the shaded porticos of the Domus, conversations were unfolding that had nothing to do with the politics of the empire, but rather the intimate and ordinary matters of daily life. Women, daughters, mothers, and wives gathered, talking about the coming festival in honor of Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. Their conversations ranged from the best sandals to wear to the gossip about the wealthy merchant's new mistress. In one courtyard, a group of women stood around a small fountain, their laughter echoing through the stone walls. One woman, a mother of 3, adjusted her tunic and smiled at her friends. "My husband says he's going to buy a new toga for the festival," she said with a mischievous glint in her eye. "I told him he'll need a lot more than that to impress me." Another woman, who had recently moved to Pompeii from another region, raised an eyebrow. "New toga? It's not the clothes that matter, dear. It's the wine that makes the evening memorable." She laughed softly, her voice warm like the summer sun. Amidst the conversations, one woman, Livia, the matron of a prominent family in Pompeii, could not shake the unsettling sensation that something was amiss. She had noticed the sky in the distance darkening just slightly, a hazy cloud lingering like a curtain being drawn over the day, but it was so faint, so subtle, that no one else seemed to notice. Instead, they continued to laugh, oblivious to the impending cataclysm that would soon turn their world upside down. By noon, the entire atmosphere had begun to shift, but only in the most imperceptible of ways. A soft tremor shook the ground beneath the feet of those walking through the streets. It was the first sign of what was to come, a warning that would be lost in the hum of Pompeii's daily life. People thought little of it, dismissing it as nothing more than a slight shift of the earth, an occasional quirk in an active region. As the hours ticked on, the sky above began to darken, its bright blue hue giving way to a faint, eerie pallor. It was not unusual for the weather to change in Pompeii, especially during the late summer, but this felt different. The air had thickened, becoming heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen were looming just out of reach. At the market, Lucius finished his business, wiping his brow as he pocketed his coins. "A storm's coming," he muttered under his breath, though he thought little more of it. He had heard similar sentiments in the past, only to be disappointed by a drizzle or a passing gust of wind. But this was no passing gust. As the afternoon progressed, the tremors became more frequent. Now the rumbling beneath the ground felt more pronounced, like the angry growl of a sleeping beast. And then, in an instant, it happened. From the distant peak of Mount Vesuvius, a thunderous explosion shattered the quietude of the day. The earth seemed to tremble with such force that buildings swayed, and the air became thick with ash. The once clear sky turned black in an instant, as if the very heavens had been consumed by the volcano's fury. The eruption sent plumes of ash and pumice into the sky, casting a deadly veil over the city. Darkness descended upon Pompeii, the midday sun swallowed by the overwhelming cloud. The vendors ran, their goods abandoned in the streets. The bathhouses, once filled with laughter and conversation, emptied in a panic as the ground shook beneath the feet of those trying to flee. Pompeii, a vibrant, thriving city, was slowly suffocated beneath the weight of Vesuvius's fury. The day, once alive with the sounds of commerce, relaxation, and gossip, was now swallowed by the ash, its streets falling silent as a town, frozen in time, was buried beneath the shadow of a volcanic nightmare. The catastrophic aftermath. The buried city. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 AD began with a terrifying violence. What had started as a distant rumbling, an unsettling tremor beneath the feet of the citizens, quickly escalated into a full-scale volcanic eruption. Within hours, the city of Pompeii was transformed from a bustling Roman town to a city caught in the jaws of a destructive force. Its streets, buildings, and people all swept into the fiery embrace of nature's wrath. The first deadly wave struck with a ferocity few could have anticipated. The initial explosion blasted a column of ash and pumice into the air, reaching an estimated height of 33 kilometers. The sky darkened as the sun was hidden by the sheer volume of volcanic material. The ash fell in heavy, choking sheets, blanketing the city and smothering everything it touched. The temperature skyrocketed, and a torrential rain of pumice and volcanic debris began to fall upon the already panicked citizens of Pompeii. At first, the people had no real understanding of what was happening. It was only the violent tremors that could not be ignored. And then came the sudden onset of ash, which thickened the air and clouded their vision. Shops, homes, and public spaces were buried under several feet of ash in a matter of hours. The collapse of roofs became inevitable as the weight of the ash accumulated, pressing down on buildings that were already compromised by the seismic activity. Those who had tried to escape were often halted by the thick, heavy ash that filled the air, turning day into night. The streets became treacherous, slippery with volcanic material and debris. But the true horror lay in what followed. For some of the unlucky souls who found themselves trapped within the city, the eruption was just the beginning of their suffering. While Pompeii's citizens had been caught unawares by the initial eruption, the real threat arrived hours later. As the eruption continued to spew ash into the air, Mount Vesuvius unleashed its most lethal weapon, pyroclastic flows. These superheated clouds of gas, ash, and volcanic debris surged down the mountain at terrifying speeds, reaching temperatures of over 500 degrees 93 to the deadly cloud, like a raging inferno, swept through the city with an unstoppable force. It descended into the streets and courtyards, consuming everything in its path. The survivors, the few who had managed to escape the initial wave, stood no chance against the fury of the pyroclastic flows. As the temperatures spiked, many who had remained in the city were suffocated by the scorching gases, their lungs filled with ash. Some were immediately enveloped in the heat, their bodies caught in a fiery, instantaneous death. Their bodies, frozen in the moments before their demise, would later be uncovered in the 18th century by archaeologists who marveled at the haunting figures they had found entombed by the ash. It was in these final moments that Pompeii's fate was sealed. The town's once proud buildings, its thriving markets and homes, were buried under layers of ash and pumice, sealing it off from the world for nearly 2 millennia. As the pyroclastic surge began to sweep through the town, it was as if Pompeii was being wiped from existence, a city of the living transformed into a silent memorial to the destructive power of nature. For centuries, the ruins of Pompeii remained hidden beneath layers of volcanic material. The city had been lost to time, its stories buried beneath the heavy ash that had engulfed it. The people of Pompeii, their lives and legacies sealed in that catastrophic event, became mere whispers in the annals of history. It wasn't until the 18th century that the city would be rediscovered. The first archaeological excavation, which took place in 1748, unearthed a world frozen in time, a snapshot of Roman life at the very moment before its destruction. The excavators unearthed homes of their frescoes still visible, abandoned marketplaces, and even artifacts that had been left behind in the rush of evacuation. But it was the discovery of the bodies mummified in their ash and debris that would have the most lasting impact. These human remains, preserved in the volcanic material, told a story of terror and desperation. Casts of the bodies were made from the voids left by decayed human remains, creating hauntingly lifelike replicas of the victims, frozen in their final moments. The discovery of Pompeii sparked a fascination that continues to this day. Each excavation revealed new and startling details about life in ancient Rome, and the site became a living museum of the past. But while the archaeological remains provided insights into the lives of the people who lived there, they also served as a reminder of the unpredictable power of nature and the fleeting nature of human existence. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius is one of the most famous natural disasters in history, but it also serves as a powerful reminder of the vulnerability of human civilization to forces beyond its control. The tragedy of Pompeii is not just a story of destruction. It is a testament to the resilience and fragility of humanity. For the people of Pompeii, the day before the eruption was a day like any other. The streets were full of life, and the markets bustled with activity. In the homes, families prepared for the coming festival, unaware that their world would soon be shattered. In the face of such overwhelming power, human lives are easily swept away, leaving behind only ruins and memories. The rediscovery of Pompeii in the modern era allowed us to peer back into a moment frozen in time. The plaster casts of the bodies serve as eerie reminders of lives lost, but they also stand as testaments to the lives that were once lived, the families that loved, and the communities that thrived. And though Pompeii was swallowed by the eruption, its legacy remains, immortalized in the ruins that now serve as a poignant reminder of both human achievement and nature's unrelenting power. Today, visitors from around the world walk the streets that were once home to thousands of citizens, marveling at the preserved homes, artwork, and architecture. And yet, the shadow of the eruption always looms over the site, a reminder that while the beauty of Pompeii has endured, its downfall remains one of the most powerful stories of nature's unbridled wrath.